Okay, so let's dive into a pretty bold prediction that's been making the rounds. This idea of a polling nightmare scenario for the Democrats in the 2026 midterm elections. We're going to break down the argument from one video analysis that claims, that they have the data to back it all up. We'll be looking at the historical trends, the polling numbers, and some political shifts that might surprise you.
The video we're looking at kicks things off with this really dramatic claim. It says the numbers are absolutely devastating for the Democratic Party. So, what numbers are they even talking about? Let's unpack the evidence they're presenting to see how they build their case for such a stark outlook. So, the whole argument they're making really rests on three main pillars. First, we're going to look at the data analysis itself. Then, we'll get into the historical context they use to frame everything. And finally, we'll dig into the real-world examples they claim are proof that their point is solid.
All right, so the entire argument really gets started with something the source calls the 50% approval rule. They present this thing as a crucial historical barometer, arguing it's one of the most reliable ways to predict how a president's party is going to do in the midterms. And this is the magic number right at the heart of their theory, 50%. The source points to a recent Insider Advantage poll that puts President Trump's approval rating right at that mark. And they argue that hitting this specific threshold is a huge deal, historically speaking, and that it really sets the stage for what's to come. So here's how they explain this 50% rule. Basically, they say, if you look back over 80 years of data, a really clear pattern emerges. When a sitting president has the approval of at least half the country, their party tends to avoid those typical midterm losses, and hey, sometimes they even make gains. And to illustrate this point, the video uses these specific examples. Check out JFK, back in 1962. His approval was at 61%, and his party saw pretty minimal losses in the House. But then you look at 1998 and 2002. With approval ratings way up in the mid-60s, both Clinton and Bush saw their parties gain seats, and that's a super rare thing to happen in a midterm, which usually sees the president's party lose ground. Okay, so that's the historical precedent the source lays out. But how does that connect to what's happening today? Well, the second part of their argument shifts gears from the president's overall approval to how voters are feeling about the parties on specific key issues. Now, to make its case, the analysis turns to a Morning Consult poll, and it's really important to note how the source frames this. They call the poll notoriously left-wing, and they use that label to argue that, look, even data from a source they see as biased against them still shows a Republican advantage. And when you look at the numbers they cite, you can kind of see why they're making that claim. On national security, this poll shows Republicans with a 10-point advantage in voter trust, and for immigration, it's an 8-point lead. The source flags these as two absolutely critical issues for voters right now. And according to the source, this pattern just keeps going when you look at economic issues. For the economy, which is often the single biggest issue in any election, the poll they cite shows a 1-point Republican lead. For the national debt, that lead actually grows to 5 points. The video's argument is that this perceived ownership of key issues is a huge challenge for Democrats. Then, the source uses generic ballot polls to try and tie this all together. It points to an RMG poll showing a 2-point Republican lead, but also a TIP poll with a 3-point Democratic lead. The key takeaway, from their perspective, is that even when Democrats are ahead, the lead is pretty slim. Not nearly enough to signal the kind of blue wave they'd need to overcome all these other headwinds they're talking about. And that brings us to the third and final piece of their argument. This is where the source tries to show that these polling numbers aren't just abstract data. They're actually having a real-world impact, leading to what they see as a tangible political realignment on the ground. The claim here is that this isn't just a theory anymore. The source argues you can actually see it happening in the actions of elected officials themselves, and they point to a recent string of Democratic politicians who are switching their party affiliation over to the Republican side. The video provides a whole list of specific examples to back this up. We're talking about a state representative in South Dakota, a pretty prominent county judge down on the Texas border, and local officials from North Carolina all the way over to New Jersey. Each one of these defections is presented as evidence of this broader realignment that's supposedly happening at the local level. So what's the reason they're giving for all these switches? Well, the source summarizes the general feeling of these officials with this quote, arguing that they're all basically saying the Democratic Party has been hijacked by the radical far-left fringe, and that it just doesn't represent their constituents' values anymore. All right, so let's pull all of these different threads together and see the complete picture that the source material is trying to paint about the 2026 midterms. So now you can really see how the source builds its case for this whole polling nightmare scenario. It's a three-step story, right? It starts with what they see as a historically strong presidential approval number, then it adds polling advantages on major issues, and it finishes with what they present as real-world proof of a political realignment actually taking place.
And all of that leads us to the final, really provocative question that this whole analysis is posing. Based on the data and the stories they're presenting, the source is arguing that a pretty significant shift is underway. The big question it leaves us all with is this: are we just seeing some short-term political currents? Or, as they suggest, are these the early signs of a much more permanent change in the American political landscape?